Hello class, welcome back to another week of INST377. So hopefully everyone has had a good week, and I think there was an extended long weekend, so I hope everyone had a good long weekend. Now, obviously, this last week we went over HTML, CSS, and really got our foray into those things. So, what we're going to be doing this week, as I briefly mentioned last week, is that we're going to really start building out full web pages in HTML and CSS, leveraging some of the features of CSS, such as layouts and divs and all these kind of things. We're going to make decent looking web pages. I'm not saying they're going to be professional grade or anything, but they're actually going to be usable websites. So I'm really excited to get started with that. And on top of that, I will also be presenting the project this week. So there'll be a separate video along with this module this week. So please keep your eye out for that. And yeah, with that, let's get started. All right. So this week we're going to really be talking a lot about web page layouts, right? So if we think about a web page, the core of every web page is really the layout, right? Because without a layout, a web page is just a blob of HTML, right? It's just a blob of text. So having structure and layouts and visuals to a web page really make what we call a web page today, right? So it's super important to have this kind of web page type layout, and being able to learn that, and hopefully being able to establish how we can make decent looking websites. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is HTML layout. So first of all, when we create a web page, as I mentioned, just putting colors and basic elements is not enough, right? If I just put colors and basic elements, again, my web page would just be a blob of text. It would be very, very boring, right? So, creating HTML layout is super important so that we can do that. So we can actually put some structure to the page. As part of this class, though, and part of this lecture, we need to really understand how to lay out elements so that we can present this concept of visual stagnation, which allows us to make things look pretty, basically, right? Visual stagnation is a concept that, if the eye looks at one very, thing so long, it just becomes stale and our mind doesn't kind of process much, right? And that's in fact why even in presentations you see, right, we try to put animations, right? Because we want your mind to continue processing and looking at things. Otherwise, just putting blobs of text doesn't help anyone, right? So there are predefined elements and ways that a user can customize HTML and make pages have certain layouts. And we'll talk about those. But basically, there are these predefined elements that HTML gives, which allows us to apply these customizations and define to the browser and to everyone saying, oh, okay, this is what I intend this element to be used for. So there's a lot of cool things we can do. And to do this kind of customization, we can't just use HTML. We have to use CSS as well, right? So remember, HTML is kind of giving you the basic building blocks, right? But CSS is putting those building blocks together. So CSS is telling us, okay, this is how it should look and the size of it and all those things. So CSS is very important with HTML. Okay? So a quick definition of HTML layout is really just the arrangement of HTML elements on a page. So here's an example of an HTML layout. So this is a web page. You can pretend this on the left here is a web page, right? And what you'll see is there's a header. So the first piece of the top, and you see this probably for almost every website, there's a little title, right? A header. And a header defines basically the header section, right? Then there's a nav. So this would define your navigation links. So every web page has something that says home, contact us, or other pages, whatever's relevant to the website. So that's what the nav defines. Then there's this concept of a section. A section defines a portion of the document, right? And then there's also an article, which is also defining an independent self-contained portion of the document. There's also this concept of a aside. Now, an aside is really interesting because let's say you have content and you want to break it up with something on the side. And you might see this a lot in news article websites, right? So what they'll have is they'll have the main content, and then on the right side they might have author info, or they might have other relevant info, right? There are also, like, I'm sure you've seen, like, on, like, there's a lot of platforms, or okay, actually you can think of it like Zoom, right? When you maximize Zoom, it creates a side, so you have the main content, the video, and then the sidebar with the like people's faces, right? So that's kind of what a side is. Okay. And then there's a footer. Footer are like defining all your document, like all your contact links and all these like small links and kind of just like copyright information and those kind of things, right? And then there's also a details, which is like additional details that the user can open and close on demand. And lastly, there's a summary, which defines a heading for the details element. Now, the first thing I'm going to call out here is that all of these things you see are very important in the sense that for HTML we need these things. But technically, without CSS, none of these magically work, right? If I just put a section or an aside, right? HTML just says, oh, it's an aside, but it doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't know, oh, I should break up the content. It just knows, oh, it's an aside. And then in CSS, we say, oh, make this aside do this, right? So really, all of this is kind of like metadata. It's more like giving the browser more information to construct a proper image of the website, but it doesn't really tell us much about about how it should appear. And that's where CSS comes in, right? So these are all these kind of semantics. And there are a few more we're not really going to cover it, but for the portion of this class, only a few of these are really important, which are like header, nav, sections, aside, and footer, right? Okay. So with that, now let's go ahead and talk about the CSS box model, right? So CSS has this concept of a box, right? So think about a normal box, right? So, you have a piece of paper here, right? We can consider this a box, right? Now, each of these boxes has different kind of like portions to it. So this is actually a very core concept to understanding different CSS elements, right? And what this allows us to do is define spaces between elements, right? Now you'll see on the left-hand side here, right, that there's a box here, and we'll go over each of the portions of this. But basically the idea is that there is this concept of a box that wraps every single CSS element, okay? So think about every single CSS or HTML, like think about a paragraph, right? There's a box around that paragraph, okay? And basically what's happening is the box is what is being styled, not necessarily the content, but the box, right? So here's some common terms, right? So first is the content. So the content of the box is where all the texts, images, all of those things appear, right? This is pretty much what we work with, right? So if you have paragraph tags, what's inside the paragraph opening and closing tag is the content, right? From there is a padding. Now, padding is interesting, right? So padding is basically the area right outside the content, okay? And what this does is it clears area around the content and the border. So think about if you had, like, I have a piece of paper here, right? So this paper has some text, right? Now you can see around this text, there's like a little gap here between the blue and the text, right? That is the padding, right? So from blue to text is padding. So that's basically the area around the content, right? Then there's a border, right? So your border, if we go back to this blue text example, is basically the whole thing, right? This whole thing is the border, right? Basically, it's around the padding and the content. Then there's a margin. So margin is basically everything outside the box, right? So what this would mean in HTML terms, right, is if I took a look at this box and I tried to put another box next to it, right? If I put a margin, what that would mean is I could only put this box this close, right? So there would be some sort of gap before I could put another box. And you can have a right margin, top margin, bottom margin, and a left margin, right? So you can have all of those. But that's exactly what a margin does. So the margin clears an area outside the border, which is the space between boxes. And so in more technical terms, if we took two paragraphs, right, and we said, hey, we want one paragraph like here, and then we want another one like 10 pixels below it, we could say, oh, okay, I want a margin from the previous paragraph to the next, right? And then in terms of padding, we could say, oh, I just want like, I want the paragraph itself to have like a bigger like total area, right? And the border is just how you want the border around the box to be stylized, right? All right, let's go to the next one. So within CSS, there's actually a couple of layouts that we can choose from. So there are three primary layout options. First is called a flexbox, second is called a grid, and third is called a float. Now, basically, there's a lot of interesting information on these type of layouts and what's the best. So basically, flexbox was actually at one point the standard. And actually for some small site, it often still is. And nowadays, though, grid is actually the most popular layout option. It allows much more flexibility and customization, and is often used for bigger sites that have more complex needs, right? So here's a great article of this. So let's open this up. So you can see there's, oh, sorry, wrong one. This is the right article. So this is actually a really great explanation about what is Flexbox, what is Grid, and what is all these things, right? And I encourage you to take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. But basically, there's a lot of benefits to either option, but Grid tends to be the winner nowadays, right? And it's very useful, right? But for this class, oh, look, I made a typo, sorry. Okay, for this class, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a simpler one, and it's going to be called float. Float is a pretty simple CSS concept and really allows a lot of customization, and it's pretty simple to understand. So that's what we're going to use for this class. Okay. So in CSS, there is this display property. The display property defines how an element is rendered in the page. There are tons of options for displays, but I'm going to go over the main ones. First, there's this concept of inline display. So these are when elements are displayed as an inline element, and basically the width and height properties have no effect if you have an inline element, okay? Then there's a block, and a block basically says, oh, okay, if there is an element, I want to make it start on a new line, and it takes up the whole width of that line, essentially. And then there's an inline block, which displays an element as an inline level block container, and the element itself is formatted as an inline element, but you can apply height and width values. And lastly, there's a none, which means you show nothing, right? And so this none is actually very valuable. So basically what this allows us to do is, for example, let's say we want to have hidden elements that only show based on certain actions or something. We can have the none element basically say, oh, display none until like some hover element or something, right? We'll talk about that too. But the none is very valuable, okay? All right. And so here's one thing I'm going to talk about. You're going to see this, like I mentioned this, and you must be looking at me right now like I'm crazy, have like 10 eyes or something. But the thing is that this is really complicated to understand until we actually practice it. So I don't really expect you to know all of this right now, but when we go over the practice, you'll see how we leverage these kind of things so that it makes sense long term, right? I don't expect you to know exactly what an inline block is, inline is, block is. I just expect you to be able to take a look and say, hey, you know, this isn't working, so maybe I should try a different display option that makes sense, right? And think about it as you're coding, right? That's all I expect. Now in CSS, there is also this concept of a clear element, right? So in CSS, I mentioned that we can do this concept of a float. So I see that, so let's first talk about what a float is, right? So a float means, like, for example, let's say I have a orange box and a yellow box, right? Now what I can do is I can say, if normally, right, in HTML, everything would just go side by side, right? And they would combine, blah, blah, blah. But let's say what I wanted to do is I wanted one element to float left and one to float right, right? So then they would go to the aligned side, right? So float right, float left. So what happens is based on the size of the element, right, they would create like basically they'd go to they'd float to one of the sides. Now the problem is when we float elements, often the next element gets mixed in with that float. Now what does that mean? So think about this, right? So a lot of times what'll happen is you'll have a float left, then you'll have a float right. But this float right will be staggered, right? Because it takes up more space or something like that. So now let's say we introduce a third element, and you can see I only have 2 hands, unfortunately. But let's say we add a third here, right? Now this third one is now interfering, right? So what we can do in CSS is we can leverage this concept of a clear. And a clear element allows you to ignore both of these floats and say, oh, okay, I'm going to start all the way at the next line below both of these floats, right? And you can do something called a clear both to ignore any of the applicable clears and start a fresh element pushed below those floats like I showed, right? So remember, like I said, we have 2 floats here, right? So we have 2 floats, and now the blue comes in, and it's like, without the clear, it would be here somewhere, but with the clear, it would start down here. So yeah. So the clear both is a very valuable thing to know, and we'll show how we do that in the lecture, or in the hands-on example, of course. But yeah, okay. All right. Now in CSS, there's also this concept of a selector, similar to what we talked about last week, but a little different. So sometimes for CSS elements, we want them to differ on certain options, right? So for an example, we want a navigation to have a hover, right? For example, if I hover over something, I want it to like change color or change background, right? For a navigation, that's very common, right? Or I want focus, right? So when I click a text box, it focuses on that piece. And there are tons of other selectors, so let's open this up. Okay. All right. So for example, there's a hover, there's a focus, there's a full screen, there's a enabled, right? So for example, if you enable an input, and think of these selectors kind of like actions, right? So based on X action, do something. So based on the hover action, do something. So that's what you can think of it as, right? So for example, you select something, then it does something, right? So for example, on hover, we want to change the background, right? That's a very common use case. Now these can be very beneficial as it really allows us to have very interactive and unique web pages. So very useful. Now, let's talk a little bit about external style sheets. So we talked briefly about this last class, right? We talked about different ways to store CSS. Now, from going forward, we will be using external style sheets, right? External style sheets allow very good segregation of HTML and CSS, and they also allow us to create shared CSS file for common CSS properties. For example, if we want to have a header shared CSS or a nav shared CSS, etc., right? External style sheets allow us to do that. Or for example, and you might ask, okay, what's the benefit of that? Well, think about multi-web page apps. Well, we want the header, nav, etc. to all be the same across all 3 pages, right? So we can have a shared external style sheet to allow for that, right? And here's an example of how easy it is to add. So we click HTML, we open up our HTML, add a head, and do link rel equals style sheet and href equals whatever the CSS name, and then we continue about our day. So that's all we have to do. So instead of putting the style inside the head element, it's a lot easier, right? And the other benefit is this allows for really clean code, right? So it won't create this huge HTML file. We'll have nice, different, separate CSS files, so it'll be a lot better for us, right? So yeah, so from this lecture onward, we'll be using external style sheets. Okay, so now with this, what we're going to do is go ahead and open up VS Code and go through a example. Now, as I mentioned, this lecture is going to be very heavy on the hands-on portion. There's very little lecture, right? That's kind of it for the lecture. So let's hop on over and get started. All right, welcome back to, of course, your favorite program, I'm sure by now, VS Code. So, all right, let's hop in. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And let's call it, let's go, I have a week 3 here. Let's call it new file. Let's call it INST377 week 3. HTML layout lecture.html. You are free to call it whatever you want. That's just what I'm doing since it helps me keep track of things. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about what we can do to build some kind of like nice experience, right? So what I'm thinking is let's go ahead and build like a class web page, right? That might sound kind of trivial, but it will help us really understand how layouts work and all these kind of things. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to build out a class page, right? It'll have like a post section, a contact section, it'll have a nav, it'll have a footer, a header, all these kind of things so that we can learn about all these elements. So let's go ahead and get started. So all we have to do, we'll start with HTML here. And in here, we'll do a simple head. So head, and we'll have a title. Okay. And let's call it INST377 hyphen class, oh my, class page. Okay. And from here, like I said, we're going to have an external style sheet. So how do we do that? So what we're going to do is we're first going to go ahead and create a new file here called new file and do INST377 week 3 HTML layout dash CSS dash lecture dot CSS. Okay, so make sure it's a dot CSS. And then from there, let's go back to our HTML page and type link rel equals quotes style sheet. Okay, close that out. Okay, and here we're going to have to add a href equal to, and we will add the CSS. Okay, should autocomplete, but yeah. Now remember, make sure the href is in here, but what this is basically saying is link and then rel, if you actually hover over it, it'll tell you. This attribute names a relationship of the linked document. So this is saying this has a relationship of style sheet, and this is a link to that relationship. So this is the link to that style sheet, right? So there we go. That's our basic start. Now let's go ahead and create out a basic body. So go ahead, create body. And what we'll start with is, let's go ahead and start by creating a header, right? So we want a nice header, and we'll see how it looks. So let's go ahead, create a header section. Header section. And let's say we call this header. And then we do close this out. And then we say, let's put a H1 here. And we can do INST377 class page. Okay. And let's go ahead and open this up. Okay. So I'll use our live pages, and there you go. So there you go. There's our header. Congrats. We have a web page. Obviously, it doesn't look very pretty yet, but we're going to go ahead and work on that, right? So let's first think about what do we want. So first of all, again, I don't really like these plain colors, so we're going to figure out a way to have a nice background color, right? So let's go ahead and do that first. So we'll go back to our HTML or our CSS and do body and add a nice background color. Okay, so I like aqua. Aqua is a good color, and there you go. So there's our first color. Now when I think about a header, I want it to be a little different, right? So there's two ways we can edit this header, right? So first, of course, we can do header, right? Right, and then we can have this background color be like, you know, like a azure, like a gray or something, right? So that's always a viable option for us. And let's think. So let's see, let's take a look here. So yep, that looks okay. Then outside of that, we're going to want to align our text. So what can we do for that? So in CSS, there's a property called text align, and we can do center, right? So what that should do is allow us to center the page. Now from there, you'll see that there is a little bit like a like a missing container, right? Or like space, right? So what can we do to fix that? Well, we could try width, right? 100% maybe. I don't think that really matters. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Okay. And then what we can do is, like I mentioned, right? If you look here, you see like all this stuff, it looks very close to the like um, border, right? So if you remember our CSS box model, right? We can add some padding to add some space between the content and the border, right? So let's go ahead and add some padding. So how do we do that? So let's look that up really quick. I mean, I am aware, but it's good to show how we can do it. So we can do padding dash top, right, bottom, or we can just do padding. And if we do that, what that'll allow us to do is say padding, and then allow us to specify 4 numbers. And the first number would be top, the second number would be right, third number would be bottom, fourth number would be left. And we could also do this. So padding 25, which would say apply 25 pixels across all 4. So to keep it simple for us, that's what we're going to do. So we'll go ahead and we'll create a padding here, maybe of 10px, maybe 10px. Let's see. All right, that looks a lot better, right? So that looks quite solid. Okay. All right, so that looks really good. Now, I'm going to ask a thought question here. So let's think about this, right? So whenever you go to a web page, typically what you probably see is that the header and the footer always match, right, in terms of styling, right? So if we wanted to do that, what could we do? Now, obviously, I'm talking to a video, but think about that for a second. What could we do? Well, the best way we could do that is add a ID to this. We could call it bar, right? Like header bar, footer bar. And instead of targeting the header, we can say target the bar. Okay. So that'll keep it the same. But what this will help us with is when we add the footer, it'll match the styling exactly the same. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the footer, right? Now, one more thing is I'm looking at this header. It doesn't look very pretty. So I want to change the font, right? I want it to have a non-plain font. So what we can do is we can use this property called font-family. So there's a font-family, okay? And for example, you could do cursive, right? And if you look at it, look at that. So it looks a lot better. So now you can see how we can start building out these kind of things. So, all right. So with that, let's get started. So, okay. So now let's go ahead and now add the main section, or the nav, I should say, rather. So if we go here in the body, after the header, we need to add a nav. So let's go ahead and say navigation menu. Okay. And so how do we do that? So what we can do is we can add a nav, and I like targeting elements. So I like adding an ID. So ID equals menu, or main nav, I should say, main nav, and close that out. Now, how do we actually create a navigation element? Well, that's a really great question. So typically what a navigation is really just a list of things, right? So it's like 3 text boxes right next to each other. So it's a list. So it's a list, but with no bullet points, right? So what we can do is we can create a unordered list, right? And we'll talk about how to remove the bullet points, but let's go ahead and do that first, right? So we have a UL, and let's say we create a announcements, assignments, and a contact info, right? So we'll create a LI here, call this announcements, if I can type. Then we can do a assignments, and then we can do a contact info. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at how that looks. Okay, well, doesn't look very great, right? It looks, let's say mediocre. let's say that. Looks mediocre at best, right? Obviously this is not a nav. A nav usually is like a bar, etc. So let's go ahead and fix this, right? So what can we do? So let's go back to our CSS, And again, we're going to target the ID. So how do we target the ID? Hashtag main hyphen nav. Okay. Okay. And what we're going to do here is, first of all, I would like it to have a different background color, right? So let's change it. So I have a good color chosen actually. Let me just copy and paste it from here. So I actually use this color usually. You can use any color of your choosing. I'm just using that. Okay. And okay. So what does that do? Right? Well, not much. Okay. Now, that is very uneventful. So now what you can do is, well, we need to remove the bullet points, right? So what you can do is you can say hashtag main nav, right? And now let's say we want to edit the elements inside the container, right? So let's say we want to edit all the list elements inside the main nav. Well, what you can do is you can take hashtag main nav and then li, which means it'll edit all the list elements. Or in this case, we want to edit all the UL, right? So we want to edit all the unordered lists in the main nav, right? And what we can do here is we can say, okay, here's the main nav. I want to edit all the unordered lists, and I want to do display, my bad. I want to edit all the ULLI elements, right? So I want to edit all the ULLI elements. And what I want to do here is I want to say list hyphen style hyphen type colon none. Okay, let's go see what that does, right? And there you go. So you see, it removes the bullet points. So now let's go over that again. So what did I do here? So what I did is I said, okay, let's look at the main nav, right? And then I want to target all the unordered lists within the main nav, and then all the lists within the unordered list. And for all of those unordered list elements, I want to make the list style type none. Okay, so if you take a look at what we did here, we want to say, okay, here's the main nav, here's the unordered list, and here's the elements we're targeting. So we're targeting all these three, okay? So now what we can do is we can say, okay, now I want them to go side by side, right? So if you remember, right, we talked about having a display element, right? So what you can do is you can use a inline block. Okay. And this will allow your elements to go side by side, essentially, right? So it allows the elements to basically line up one next to the other, right? So let's take a look at that. Well, look at that. It's starting to look better, right? Not great, but it's starting to look better, okay? So we're starting to see it started to like kind of shape out to be what it is, right? So now from there, what we can do is we can add some padding, maybe, right? We want to add like a little bit of space between these. So let's add some padding. 10px maybe, right? Beautiful. Look at that. Look how solid that looks. And then we can actually also add a text align, right? I want it to be like centered. Okay. There you go. So these are centered now. Now we could also center it on the page itself. So let's see if that works. That might not work the way we expect it to because, and I'll be honest with you, CSS is very, very finicky. So it can sometimes be a little bit of a fun adventure to try things. But there you go. Yeah, so we have 3. Okay, so we can do that. Okay. All right, so there you go. So now we have basically the main thing set out. Now I will say, let's see, I am not a huge fan of some of this. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, you know, wouldn't it be great if when I hovered over this, it changed state, right? Because otherwise, how do I know what to like click, right? I want to be able to say, oh, you know, when something is hovered, then I want to be able to see that, oh, it's hovered, right? So how do we do that? So if you remember, we talked about CSS selectors, right? So there is a hover CSS selector. So let's look at that, hover, right? And that's on, if you go to this web page, that should be here on this link. So if you go there, there's a hover, right? So what this allows us to do is say, element colon hover do something or change something, right? So let's go ahead and take a stab at it, right? So let's say we have let's go here and do a hashtag main nav, and then we did li, and then we did colon hover. Okay. And here what we did was we said background color colon there's like a gray that works for me usually. Yeah, this one, 7C. And we changed the text color to white. Okay, there you go. Let's take a look. All right. Now, actually, before I do this, right, a lot of you are going to ask me, hey, why did we do it to the list and not to the main nav? It's a great question. So before I do this, let's try it, right? So let's do main nav colon hover and see what happens. Okay. Now, watch this. Look at that. So if I do it on the main nav, the whole nav, the hover of the whole nav changes color, which is kind of cool, but doesn't really help us, right? Because what we want to see is that when I hover over a specific page or specific list element, I want that to change color, right? Because yeah, it doesn't matter to me if this changes color. It doesn't help us much, right? So what we can do is we can do main nav li colon hover. So on the list element. And if you look here, look at that. So you see that? So now they're all changing. That's pretty cool, right? So now we're able to see that, oh, okay, this is like actually working. Now, let's go ahead and start adding a little bit more complexity to this, right? So let's say we go here, we have an announcements page, we have an assignments page, we have a contact info. Now, for every single assignment, you might want like a list of all the assignments, right? That's what I would think, right? I hover over it. I want to see assignment 1, 2, 3, right? I want to see the list. So let's go ahead and add those. So we're going to go here. And what you do to do that is within the li, you can actually add a UL. So this is actually a issue that many students had. So remember, this UL has to be within the li. So you see how there's a starting li and a closing li? Put an enter here. And now put the UL. So put a UL, okay? And now you put your list elements. So you can say assignment 1, okay, li, assignment 2, li, assignment 3, okay? Now, a good trick in VS Code is that when you click an element, it'll tell you like its corresponding matching one. So make sure your li matches up and the ul is within the li. So just as a heads up, because I did notice that sometimes that's a common mistake that's made. It's a very easy mistake to make. So all right, let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when we do this now. So now, yikes. That's what happens, apparently. Yikes. That doesn't look good. So basically what's happening now is that it's basically saying, oh, you know, like everything's visible, right? And we don't want that, right? So let's go ahead and see how we can fix this. So what we can do is let's go to the main nav and let's see what we can do. So let's say we do main nav and we do ul and then target all the uls underneath the ul, right? So remember, let's go back here, right? So there's a ul and then there's another set of uls, right? So let's go ahead and target those. So what we can do here is we can do display colon none, okay? And then position colon absolute, okay? That's more of a thing to make it look better, but doesn't matter. Now look at that. You don't see it. But now you're like, hey, great, I don't see it, but now I literally don't see it. What do I do, right? Great question, right? So what you can do now is, let's think about this. So what we have is we have a list element. So when we hover over that list element, we want the UL elements to show, right? So what if we targeted the ULs under a list hover, right? So what we can do here is we can say hashtag main nav and then do li colon hover and then add UL, right? So this is saying, give me all the ULs underneath a hovered list, right? And the great thing about HTML is if it doesn't exist, it just won't do anything. It doesn't care. So now what we can do is we can say display and block, right? Now let's see what happens when I do that. Well, look at that. You see, all of them now have the thing, right? Now, of course, we will have to make some updates because they don't look right. So let's first go ahead and create a background color for them. I'm going to keep the same background color as I did for the top one. So just going to copy this. So we're going to have a background color, right? So if we go here, you can see a lot better now, right? But now, obviously, we want them to be like a vertical, right? That's what I want at least. So what we can do is we can have a, let's say a float, and we can float it left, right? So that what that'll say is every single element we want it to move to the left, right? Let's see what happens now. Okay, didn't do much. Yikes. Okay. Did not help us as much as I hoped. Okay. Let's see. If we add a position : absolute, that might help. Nope, that didn't help me at all. Okay, so now let's think about what we can do here to fix this, right? So we need to target the hover elements. Maybe we need to make the LI positions. Let's see. So if we go to the LI, yes, I think that's the problem. So what we need to do here is we need to make all the list elements display as inline block so that they basically fit. So what we can do here is we can add a hashtag main nav li and do display : inline block. Okay, let's go see what that does. That did not help at all. This is terrible. This is horrific. Okay, we'll try this too. Okay, there we go. So what did we do here, right? You just saw me put a bunch of random stuff, and you're like, what is this dude doing? Great question. So what we did is we said, okay, in the hashtag main nav, target the list elements. And now remember, this targets the top level list, sub lists, whatever it is, and put them inline block, right? So what is inline block? So this determines the type of blocks that are like, let's go over the documentation here. You can open them up. Inline block, right? It applies different display values on the div, which contains like child elements, right? So you can see like a block, it's the whole thing, but an inline block is saying for just the elements, and then there's text, right? And this is actually a great example of how these things work. So great idea to take a look at this, right? So pretty cool. Okay. So yeah, it helps us basically center and basically align everything, right? So we have a main nav list, and then what we did is on the hover, we wanted to float left. So it basically tells all the elements to go and float left within the div, or within the list, because it's inline block. It just moves everything to the left, right? So pretty cool. Now, let me be honest with you. That is obviously pretty complicated. I don't expect you to get that on the first try. But I expect, like, what I would look forward to is just go ahead and try some things, see how it works. But that's basically what it does, right? Now, there is obviously still some issues, right? So if we go back to our page here, when we hover, there's like a weird gap here, right? And that's a really weird thing. I'm sure we can fix it, right? So let's take a look at how we might be able to fix that. So that's saying on the hover, right, there might be some sort of padding or float that might not be working, or on the UL there might be something, right? So let's go ahead and take a look here. So in the UL, yeah, let's try this. Let's try padding 0 maybe. There we go. Look at that. All right, so there you go. So we reduce the padding, so it removes the content around the border or around the content, and it looks pretty solid now, right? So it's starting to look like a real website, right? So pretty cool. All right. So now we figured out a really complicated section. I would argue this is probably one of the more complicated sections of the web page. But now let's keep going, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to create like basically a two-part portion here, right? So what I want to do and envision, take a step and envision what I'm thinking, right? So what I'm thinking is on like the left side of the page here, we'll have like a posts, right? So different posts, blah, blah, blah. And on the right side, we'll have like a contact page. So we'll say, oh, contact me, contact this, blah, 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 right? So that's what we want, right? So we'll build something like that. So let's talk about how we might do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a main container. Right? So we can call this the hashtag main text area, right? And we can do div class equals main container. Okay. Now I do want to show you what I'm kind of building here, right? So give me just a second here to open up this. Okay. So I'm going to annotate the screen. So what I'm trying to build here is in this area, I want there to be like a container. Okay. Now, if you look at this container, this is the main container, right? This is what we're going to call we'll call this here the main hyphen container. Okay. And ignore the font, it's not great, but either way. Then what we're going to do is we're going to build like a announcements box right here. And then we're going to build like a sidebar box, right? I hope you're starting to see what I'm trying to envision, right? So what we'll call this is maybe we'll call this hashtag content area, right? I'm just putting hashtags as so it's clear. And then maybe we call this hashtag aside, right? Like the side, right? And then within the content area, I want different posts. So maybe we have like multiple boxes here that basically are like posts, right? So we have a post here, post there, blah, 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 right? So we have all this stuff, right? And then in the aside, we have like a content, like a contact me or something, right? So we have something like this. So this is kind of what I'm trying to build out, right? And when you're building web pages, it's really great to kind of try and visualize what you're doing, right? So maybe you'll put it on a piece of paper and visualize, hey, this is what I'm trying to build. So then you can go back and look at it and reference it, right? So this is kind of what we're trying to build. Now I'm going to clear this out, but this is the idea. Okay, cool. Right, so, all right. So now let's go back. So first we'll focus on that main container, right? So in that main container, what we'll do is we'll have this, maybe we'll say announcements, right? So we'll say like, oh, this is the announcements section, right? Announcements, right? And then what we'll do is, remember, if you look in that diagram, right, I want like one portion on one side, one portion on the other. So I'll create a div for both of those sides. So I'll create a div class equals content hyphen area. Okay. And we'll put something in here and we'll put that as a to-do. And then I want the right side, which will be like our contact. And I'll use a aside for that. We can call, and again, I still want an ID here. And we can call that contact. Okay. So now here's our basic stuff, right? So we have all this kind of like, okay, this is what I want in here. This is what I want to see, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So now what's really difficult is what we're going to want to do is figure out a way to say, hey, I want to separate this out and separate this out. I want these two things to kind of be like separate elements, right? So what we can do is, first of all, let's try and visualize how this might work. So what I want to do is first focus on the content area, right? So let's go here and go to the content area. And now notice, this is a class, right? So it's going to be dot. So it's going to be dot content dash area. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll put a width. So I'll say this content area is going to be 70% of my screen. Okay. And we'll do a float. And what we'll do is we'll say, okay, I want it to I want it to float left, right? Because I want it to be on the left side of my screen. And for now, I'll put a margin of 0, but we can always adjust that, okay? Okay, perfect. Now we'll go to our page. Obviously nothing, you can see nothing, right? It just looks like a normal thing, right? So what we're going to do is, just for the sake of visibility, we're going to add a border. So how do we add a border? So for a border, what you do is you type border and then say the size. So let's say we want a 2px border. We want it to be, let's say, dashed, right? And we want it to be black, okay? Just for now, and we might remove that later, okay? So you can see there's all this stuff. Now you might say, hey, when you showed it to me on the diagram, it looked like it went the whole page. Well, that's a great question. Right now, there's no content inside, so that's why you can't see anything, right? It just looks like there's nothing, right? So what we'll do now is we'll also build out the contact in the same way, okay? So if we go back to contact, contact is a ID. So what we can do is a hashtag contact. And what we'll do here is, let's say we add a width, right? Now you might ask, oh, the width should be 30%, right? Because 70% was on the main or in the content area, so then the contact should be 30. Yes and no. So unfortunately, because of the way the margins work and everything, if you put it as 30%, it'll actually float over to the next side. It won't fully fit on the page. So you always have to leave a little bit of a gap. So usually you do 25% is usually what I recommend, right? Always leave about a 5% margin of error, because that's usually how it is, right? So that's my recommendation. And then from there, again, let's do a float, but we're going to float it right this time, okay? And then we're going to add a border. So we'll do this, and we'll make it purple this time, just so we know that's a different thing. Purple. Okay. All right, beautiful. All right, there. Oh my gosh, purple and black look almost the same on my screen because of the colors. Let's try green instead. Better. All right, survivable. Okay, very bad color choice on my part. Maybe I should try like a red. Red should work, right? Okay, very distinctive. Okay, so now you can see we're starting to build out a element here, right? So we're seeing, oh, okay, this is where I put my announcements. This is where I put my sidebar, okay? So now let's go ahead and start building out our announcements. So what do we want in our announcements? Well, as I mentioned, right, I want kind of like 3 posts. I want posts to show up, right? And I want each of those posts to have the same exact styling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another div. And this div is going to be called, let's call it content box, right? That's what I'll call it, okay? And in this, it'll have a h1, and this will say this is content box 1, and then we'll say, then do lorem ipsum, right? So just some random text, right? So, oh my. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll create 3 of these, right? Because I just kind of want to put some sample data so we know what we're doing. Just change all of these here. Okay. And let's take a look at how it looks. Okay. All right. So now you can see, okay, this is how it's starting to look. Doesn't look great, but I'm sure we can fix that, right? So let's go ahead and modify this content box. So what we'll do is we'll add a dot content hyphen box, right? And what we'll do is we'll add a background color, right? So background color, I don't want it to be I don't want it to be a full white. I want it to be like a corn silk might work, right? A lightish, like an off-white color. Then we want the text color to be black, right? On that off-white. And then I want to add some padding. I want to add some margin, right? Because I want this to kind of like stand out. I want it to kind of be like its old thing. So I want to add some 10px, and I want to add some margin, right? And actually, before I do that, I want to show you how it looks before margin so you can get an idea, right? So you can see there's this. Put these side by side, actually. Okay. And what we'll do here is we will add a border, and we'll do a 2px solid black. All right, hello class. I apologize. You might see an abrupt cut. My computer randomly crashed, but anyway. All right, back to this. All right, so in the content box, we were talking about a border, right? So I added a nice border, added some padding. Now, obviously, there's no gap between these, right? So what I'm going to do is add some margin, right? So margin, and I'm going to add like, let's say 10px of margin, right? And now look at that. So now this looks like, oh, I'm starting to see some like kind of structure to this page. I'm seeing like an announcement section, all these kind of things, right? So it's starting to look very decent, right? Now, you might ask, okay, how is all of this floating left? Really great question, right? And that's because all of this is contained within the content area. So the content area has its confinements, and then everything within the content area follows the confinements of the content area unless it's explicitly overwritten somehow. So what it's saying is the content area has a width of 70%, so you have to stay within that 70%, right? Unless you do something like with 110%, 110%, then it'll overflow. Otherwise, it will always stay within the content area. Okay. So, yeah, great. So now there we go. Now we see this great announcements like this box. Now we need to expand our sidebar a little bit, right? So we have this great contact with this announcements, but I also want to make a contact, right? So in the aside, what do we kind of want? Maybe we want some information, like maybe a contact info, right? And then we want to add like a maybe like a line, and then maybe like some information. So maybe like my name, and then maybe my email, right? Email :a-2 at umd.edu maybe. And then we have a form, okay? Then what will this form do? Maybe we can make a contact form, right? So we could say, you know, we'll create a very simple form. It'll have a label, for equals name. Oh, whoops. Name : right? And then we'll have an input, right? Input type equals text, and then name equals name, and then we'll have an ID maybe, so we can customize it later, and we'll have a submit. There you go. So there you go. So now we have this really nice contact form. Now it doesn't look too pretty, and we'll go ahead and make some changes so that looks better. So let's go ahead, go to our contact, and let's think. So first of all, I want some margin, of course. I also want it to be a different background color, right? I want it to be like maybe like a greenish color. So I already have one selected. So I actually chose using RGB. So what you can do in CSS is you can use this RGB and give it like the red, pixel, green, and blue. So that's also an option. And I want it to have a margin, right? So let's add a margin here. Like maybe 20px. Oh, okay. So look at what happened here. So I added so much margin that it broke, right? So let's go back, right? So say we add margin. Let's say I only want some margin on the right, right? Maybe I only want it to be on the right. Let's some 25px maybe. Okay, much better. And then, you know, I think it's really tightly coupled. Let's add some padding, right? That really needs some padding, maybe some 10px padding. Okay, it broke again. So maybe I need to reduce the margin. Beautiful, okay? Now this looks pretty solid, right? So now you can see, oh, okay, pretty good. Now, if you look at this, our web page is almost done, right? It looks pretty solid. We have a pretty good looking web page, right? and yeah, looks great. And we can also, put in a name and submit and all those kind of things. Should work, right? We have a header, all these kind of things. Now let's take it up a notch, right? So first of all, let's take a look at how this could look. First of all, in a professional website, we probably don't have these borders, so let's get rid of those. So I'm going to get rid of the border here and get rid of the border here. Okay, so there you go. Looks pretty professional, pretty good. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to think about adding something cool, right? So for example, what if when a user clicks the name, this changes color? We can do that, right? So if we go back to CSS, right? CSS selectors. Okay. There is this selector called focus, right? So when you select an input element, it can do something. So what we can do is we can say, what do we call this? We added an ID. We called it contact name, right? So we can say hashtag contact hyphen name colon focus. And we can change the background color to be, say, crimson. Change the color of the text to be white. Okay, let's take a look at what happens. Wow, look at that. So now looks totally different, right? Isn't that really cool? So yeah, so there you go. Now there is one piece missing of this website, right? A footer, right? So first of all, let me move myself to the left here. All right. So we need to add a footer, right? So let's go ahead and add a footer. So how do we add a footer? Well, ideally, what we can do is we can just say footer, and say footer, and then what we can do is we can say ID equals bar, right? If you remember, that's what we also labeled the header, right? Right here. So now they'll both be applying the same exact styling, right? And then we can just do paragraph and do copyright of someone, comma, somewhere, right? And let's take a look. Now you look at this and then you're like, hey, something is wrong here. The footer doesn't look right. And you're right, because if you look at where the footer is, it is not in the right place, right? It's in like the middle here for some weird reason, right? And that's because, if you remember, we talked a little bit about this, but when you do floats, that can really mess up like how you're like doing things, right? It can really like kind of like mess with like how you like how things appear, right? So what we can do is we can probably change this a little bit, right? So what we can do here is we can put this aside, and what we can do is in the bar, what we can do is let's go to the bar and we can do a clear colon both, and look at that. So now, because we cleared the element, it now shows up below the bar, right? So there you go. So now with this, we actually have almost a full-fledged website, right? So we have like a very legitimate working kind of like decent looking, maybe with some funky colors looking website, right? So it looks pretty decent, right? Now let's talk a little bit more about what we could do here. I think for the most part, our thing looks really good, right? Like I don't see much of an issue. It looks pretty solid. Let's just make sure we're all good here. Yeah, I mean, I think it looks great. Yeah, I mean, there is nothing really like hugely concerning here. I don't see any like issues, right? The one thing we could do, right, is this whole main text area is in its own main container, and maybe we could put a border around that to signify that this is like the main portion of the page, right? Or we could even make that have a different background color. I don't really want that, but we'll see. So let's go ahead and try that. So what we can do is we can add a dot main dash container here, and we can say border Then we can do 2px dashed, and let's do like a funky color, yellow. Yeah, there we go. Look at that. All right. Now with this, you'll notice something. I made a mistake, right? If you look at the border, which you might not be able to see, honestly, but the footer is inside the border. So what does that mean I did? I put the footer in the wrong place. So we should go ahead and move that. The footer should actually be outside the main content area. Okay, much better. Yes. Okay, great. Let's just make sure I'm doing everything right here. Yes. Okay, great. Looks a lot better now. Okay, cool. All right. Now with that, let's say we add a, yeah, this doesn't look very good, does it? Ah, it looks like kind of weird actually. Let's say in the main container, we set a width of 100%. What will that do? 100%. And height of 100%. Okay, this does something interesting, right? So what's happening is because the main container, right, contains all these elements, when I set the height, it actually takes up the height of the whole page, right? Like basically it artificially kind of defines a height, right? So if you look at this, right, it like makes you scroll down because of how it works. So you could do this. I probably wouldn't recommend it. So actually, you know what? I'm going to go back on my word, change this, right? And I will just have it have a border radius of maybe like 15px. And well, I probably have to define the border, right? 2px solid black. Okay. Now, again, because I didn't set a height, what's happening is it's only taking this top element, which is kind of weird, actually. I'm kind of surprised that it's doing that, but it's probably due to like our display elements and stuff. So what we can do here is now we can set the height so that we can get this like border radius. Okay. You can see now we've added like a nice little border, and you know what? We should probably add a little bit of a margin too, because it's kind of bleeding on the left side. So we should add a margin dash left, maybe a 5px or so. Let's make it a little more. Maybe let's do 10px. Much better, right? Yeah. Okay. So there you go. So now look at that. So now we have a full page, right? This looks like a very solid page. We basically have like all the key things, and that's basically it. All right. So yeah, so with that, that is basically the whole thing. That is how you make a web page in HTML with all these kind of like structures and all these kind of things. And it's really fun. So I really encourage you to experiment, kind of try out what you can do and accomplish, because there's a lot of interesting variations. And your lab actually is kind of similar to this. You have to build out kind of a web page. So it's a lot of fun. So yeah, as you go through CSS, there will be problems, right? CSS is very finicky, right? There's a lot of memes about CSS because it is super finicky. So yeah, let me know, let me or one of the TAs know if you have any issues, because it could just be small things, and we can hopefully help you out really quickly. But I also encourage you to look up things on the internet, right? If you're seeing any issues, take a look, see if there's any simple solutions, right? I really encourage you to try that first before reaching out, because that'll really help you learn and fight through like the challenges and push your knowledge, right? So I think that's a really great option, right? So with that, you will now see, or that is it for this lecture, and you will see another video for the project. So feel free to take a look at that, and you'll get your project groups, and I'll talk about all of that. Okay. All right. Thank you all, and I will see you all in the next lecture.